Miranda Ashcroft set the pen down on the kitchen table like she was signing a grocery list. $40,000. That was the number she'd written beside Serafina's name. Not a ransom, not a ransom note. A receipt, a bill of sale. Her stepdaughter, 23 years old, still sleeping down the hall, reduced to a line item in a debt she had never once owed. The man across the table didn't blink. Dante Moretti folded the paper in half, slid it into the inside pocket of his jacket, and stood without a word. He left an envelope on the table. Miranda counted the cash before the front door had even closed. Serafina heard none of it. She was already in bed, already dreaming of a life that no longer existed. By morning, everything had changed. If you were in her place, sold in the dark, by the one person left who was supposed to protect you, what would you do? If this story grips you, hit the like button right now and drop your city or country in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. Subscribe so you never miss what comes next. Because where Serafina is going, nothing is going to be simple and nothing is going to be safe. Part 1. The storm had been building since mid-afternoon, the kind that came off the Pacific and sat on the coast like it had unfinished business. By the time it finally broke, rain was hitting the windows of the Ashcroft house in flat, hard sheets, and the power had flickered twice in the last hour. Serafina was in the bathroom when the knock came. Not at the front door. At her bedroom door. 3 knocks. Deliberate. Too slow to be casual. She turned off the faucet and stood still, listening. She'd lived in this house for 6 years, since she was 17, since her father's funeral, since Miranda had looked at her across the grave and said, with genuine flatness, "We'll have to make this work." And she had learned to read the sounds of it the way a sailor reads water. The creak of the third stair meant Miranda was coming up. The particular silence after the television cut off meant she'd had too much wine and would be difficult in the morning. The knock at that hour, at that rhythm, meant something she didn't have a word for yet. "Serafina," Miranda's voice through the door, clipped. "Come downstairs." "It's past 11. "I know what time it is. Come downstairs." She dressed quickly, jeans, a gray pullover. She didn't know why she bothered. It was the middle of the night. There was no one to impress. But getting dressed felt like putting on armor, and she had learned early that you never walked into Miranda Ashcroft's kitchen unprepared. The man at the table was not what she expected. She'd expected a creditor. Miranda had been cycling through creditors for 2 years, men in cheap sport coats who sat in the kitchen and talked about payment schedules while Miranda poured them coffee she'd never intended to pay for. This man was not wearing a cheap sport coat. He was wearing a suit that probably cost more than 6 months of the mortgage Miranda never paid on time. He was sitting with his hands folded on the table, not fidgeting, not checking his phone, not doing any of the small restless things people do when they're waiting. He was simply still. He looked up when Serafina came in. Dark eyes. Not warm, not cruel exactly, but measuring. The way a surgeon looks at a chart before anything has started, before the emotion of the situation has had time to enter the room. "Sit down," Miranda said. Serafina didn't sit. "Who is this?" "His name is Mr. Moretti. Sit down." "I didn't ask for his last name." The man, Moretti, said nothing. He watched her remain standing with what might have been the faintest trace of interest. Or maybe it was just how his face was arranged. Miranda crossed her arms over the front of her robe. She was 61 years old and had the posture of a woman who had spent a lifetime winning arguments by sheer attrition. "You're going to want to sit," she said. "What I'm about to tell you is going to upset you, and you should be sitting." "Then tell me fast." Miranda's jaw tightened. She glanced once at Moretti. Not for permission, Serafina thought, but for something, some kind of steadying. And then she reached into the pocket of her robe and put a folded piece of paper on the table. Serafina picked it up. She read it twice, because the first time didn't make sense. $40,000. Her name. A debt figure itemized over 18 months of what was listed as living expenses, medical costs, administrative fees. At the bottom, Moretti's name and a signature line that had already been signed. And below that, in Miranda's handwriting, payment in full, acknowledged. The room went very quiet. "You sold me," Serafina said. "I settled a debt." Miranda's voice was flat and unapologetic. "You've been living in this house for 6 years. Eating here, using the utilities, taking up space. I've been working here. I worked at the pharmacy for 3 years. I paid rent. You paid toward rent. There's a difference. There's been a balance. There is no balance. Serafina's voice didn't crack. She was proud of that in some distant compartment of herself. You made this up. Miranda said nothing, which was its own kind of answer. Serafina looked at the man across the table. You paid $40,000 for me. Yes, Moretti said. It was the first word he'd spoken since she walked in. His voice was low, precise, the voice of a man who did not fill silence out of habit. Why? It was a reasonable arrangement. For who? He didn't answer that. You can't do this, Serafina said, turning back to Miranda. Whatever you think this is, whatever legal fiction you've constructed, this isn't real. You can't sell a person. I settled a documented debt, Miranda said. You're 23 years old. You're an adult. This was a financial agreement between two adults. Between you and him, I didn't agree to anything. Your living expenses created the obligation. Your presence created the debt. Miranda picked up the envelope from the counter. The cash, Serafina realized. The $40,000, already in her hands, already spent in her mind. This closes it. Serafina turned to Moretti again. He was still watching her, patient, almost academic. And if I leave, she said, if I just walk out that door right now, you'd be walking into a storm, he said, and you have nowhere to go. He said it without cruelty, which was somehow worse. He said it like a fact because it was a fact, and he had already assessed it before she walked into the room. She had $43 in her bank account. Her last close friend had moved to Portland 2 years ago, and they hadn't talked since Christmas. Her father's family was in Ohio, and she had no relationship with any of them. She had a phone with a cracked screen and a car that needed a new alternator and hadn't started in 6 weeks. Nowhere to go. He was right, and she hated him for it. What happens to me now? She said. Not a question exactly, more like a woman taking inventory of damage. You come with me, Moretti said. Tonight. And then what? And then we'll see. She looked at Miranda one last time. Her stepmother was holding the envelope with both hands, looking somewhere past Serafina's shoulder. She had the expression of a woman who had made a decision and was now simply waiting for the aftermath to finish so she could go back to sleep. 6 years. 6 years of cooking dinners that went unacknowledged, of managing the bills Miranda left on the counter, of covering medical co-pays with her own pharmacy checks, of being called difficult, dramatic, ungrateful. 6 years of being told she was lucky to have a roof over her head. And now the roof itself had been monetized. The debt was real to Miranda because Miranda had decided it was real, and what Miranda decided became the weather that Serafina lived inside. She went upstairs and packed a bag. She didn't take much. A week of clothes, her passport, her father's watch, a battered Seiko that had stopped keeping time 2 years ago, but still felt like the most important object she owned, and the small notebook where she'd been keeping financial records of the household for the past year, back when she still thought that documentation might someday matter. It took her 11 minutes. She didn't cry. Moretti was waiting by the front door when she came back down. Miranda was not in the kitchen anymore. Serafina heard the television go on upstairs. Outside, a black SUV was idling in the rain. A man in a dark jacket stood at the passenger door. He opened it without looking at her. She got in. The drive took 40 minutes. Serafina watched the city dissolve and then the highway stretch, and then the highway end. And then they were on coastal roads that wound up into cliff country, where the houses sat behind walls and gates, and the Pacific was a black noise far below. She didn't ask where they were going. Moretti sat in the front seat and didn't speak. The driver didn't speak. The only sound was rain and the engine and the occasional creak of the wipers. When the gate opened, iron, heavy, set into a stone wall that ran out of sight in both directions, Serafina understood for the first time that she was not going somewhere temporary. The estate was large and deliberately understated from the outside, the way serious money often was. Stone and glass, old trees, a motor court lit with low amber lights. 2 men at the front steps who watched the car arrive with the careful attentiveness of people who had been trained to do exactly that. Inside, a woman named Claudia, 50s, efficient, the kind of capable that required no introduction, showed Serafina to a room on the second floor. Large, clean, a window that faced the ocean, or what would be the ocean in the morning when you could see anything. Locks on the door? Yes, but the locks were on the inside. Mr. Moretti says you're not a prisoner, Claudia said, but you're not to leave the property tonight. And tomorrow? That's not my question to answer. She set a glass of water on the bedside table. There are clothes in the closet, basic things. If you need anything, press the button by the door. Serafina stood in the center of the room after Claudia left and listened. The house was quiet. Not the quiet of an empty house, but the quiet of a house that was always watched, always accounted for, where nothing happened accidentally. It was a controlled silence, and she'd expected it to feel like a cage. It didn't. She sat on the edge of the bed, and the mattress was firm and clean, and the sheets smelled like nothing, not like Miranda's house, which smelled like wine and old carpet and the particular staleness of a space where resentment had seeped into the walls. This room smelled like nothing, and nothing had never smelled so good. She took out her father's watch and held it. The second hand didn't move. She thought about crying and decided against it. She thought about escape and ran the numbers. No money, no car, cliff roads in a storm, 2 armed men at the front entrance, and a man somewhere in this house who had paid $40,000 for her and seemed in no particular hurry about anything. Flight was theatrical. She was not theatrical. What she was tired. Bone-deep tired in a way she'd been carrying so long she'd stopped noticing its weight until this moment, sitting on a clean mattress in a room that was not hers, but had locks that opened from the inside. She fell asleep before she meant to. In the morning, there was a tray outside her door. Coffee, toast, a small glass of orange juice. Whoever had left it had done so without knocking. She ate. She thought. She looked out the window at the ocean, which was pewter gray and restless under a sky that hadn't decided yet what it wanted to do. The estate grounds were visible from up here. Stone paths, clipped hedgerows, a garage with 4 bays, 2 men walking the perimeter in a slow, unhurried circuit that she could already identify as a rotation. She noticed the gap. It was small, the north corner of the property where the hedge met the wall, and the rotation put both men at maximum distance. Maybe 90 seconds of unobserved space. She filed it without deciding what to do with it. That was what her father had taught her. Collect information before you make decisions. Write it down if you can. Never move on a single data point. She opened her notebook to a fresh page and wrote, North corner gap. Rotation approx 8 2-man team. Possible blind spot at wall junction. Then she paused and looked at what she'd written. She was mapping the security of a crime lord's estate. 24 hours ago, she'd been rinsing a coffee mug in Miranda Ashcroft's kitchen. She almost laughed. Didn't. Moretti found her in the library at 10 o'clock. She hadn't known there was a library until she'd followed the corridor down past a room with covered furniture and another with exercise equipment and pushed open a door she thought might be a bathroom. Floor-to-ceiling shelves. A reading chair by the window. Books arranged by subject, not alphabetically. History, economics, law, architecture. The organizational logic of someone who read for function rather than pleasure. She was standing in the middle of it, looking at the spines when he appeared in the doorway. Claudia said you were up early, he said. Couldn't sleep. She'd slept 8 hours, which was more than she'd managed in months. He came into the room. He was wearing dark pants and a collared shirt, no jacket. The suit from last night was gone. He looked marginally less formal and exactly as unreadable. Do you read? She asked. Some. These are organized by topic. I know. He glanced around the room as if seeing it from outside himself. My father's system. I kept it. She turned to face him. I want to know what you actually want from me. What are your options? He said. You didn't pay $40,000 to give me a nice room and let me read. No. So what's the structure? He was quiet for a moment. Not avoidant. She was already learning the difference between his silences. This one was a man choosing his words with the care of someone who had learned that imprecision was expensive. I needed your stepmother to believe the arrangement was transactional, he said. She's the kind of person who only releases what she owns when there's something in it for her. She doesn't own me. No, she doesn't. He said it simply, without the flinch people sometimes had when they were caught in a moral position. But she believed she did. and I needed her to let you go." "Why?" He looked at her steadily. "Because you were going to be destroyed if you stayed." The words landed in a strange way. Not warm, not reassuring, just plainly and practically said, the way you'd describe a building that needed to come down before it hurt someone. "You don't know me," she said. "I know that you spent 3 years subsidizing a woman who was documenting a fraudulent debt against you, that you never filed a complaint because you had no money for a lawyer and no family to call, and that 6 months ago you withdrew from a nursing program you'd been working toward for 2 years because she convinced you the tuition was unaffordable while she was spending the household income on—" He paused briefly. "Other things." Serafina stared at him. "You researched me before I walked into that house. Why?" He looked at her steadily. "Because I don't make decisions without information." She turned back to the shelves. Her heart was doing something uncomfortable, and she needed a moment to make sure it didn't show on her face. He'd known. Before last night, before the kitchen, before the document with her name on it. He'd known who she was. Known about the nursing program. Known about the debt. The question she couldn't answer yet, the question that sat in her chest like a stone that was going to need examining very carefully, was, why did it matter to him who she was before he bought her? Because bought wasn't quite the word for what had happened. Was it? "You said I'm not a prisoner," she said. "You're not." "Then why am I here?" He was at the door now. "Because I have a problem," he said, "and I think you can help me solve it." He paused. "And because you needed somewhere to be." He left. She stood in the library for a long time, looking at the economics shelf. Her father had been an accountant, a good one. He'd spent 20 years watching money and understanding that money was never just money. It was a record of decisions, a map of intentions. "Numbers tell stories," he used to say. "You just have to speak the language." She'd grown up speaking it. She'd grown up watching the ledgers, asking the questions, following the logic of why a number was where it was and not somewhere else. The nursing program had been her own idea, a pivot, a bet on a different future. But the numbers, the patterns, the way information organized itself into truth, that was something she'd had since childhood. Something about the organization of this house, the controlled quiet of it, the men on rotation in the grounds, the books arranged by topic, the man who didn't waste words. Something in all of it was beginning to click into a pattern she didn't have a name for yet. She opened her notebook, wrote 2 words. "He knows." Then, beneath it, a question she'd need to answer before she made any other move. How much? The rest of that first day was strange and ordinary at the same time, the way the first day of anything unfamiliar always is. Before you know the rhythms well enough to read them, before you can tell the difference between what is normal here and what is an exception. She ate lunch alone in the kitchen, served by a man named Piero, who did not make eye contact but set the food down with quiet care. The lunch was good, better than good. She hadn't eaten a meal she didn't cook herself in a long time. In the afternoon, she walked the indoor corridor and counted doors and listened. The house was never silent. There were men moving on the ground floor, voices occasionally, a phone ringing somewhere and being answered within a single ring. But none of it reached her. She was in a pocket of the house that had been kept separate from whatever the rest of it was. At 4 o'clock, Claudia came to her door. "Mr. Moretti asked if you're willing to meet with him, his office. 15 minutes. "Willing," Serafina said. "That's an interesting word." Claudia allowed a small, careful, almost smile. "He said to say willing." His office was at the end of a corridor on the ground floor behind a door that was heavier than it looked. The room was large and spare, desk, 2 chairs, a window, a filing cabinet that was closed and likely locked. No personal photographs, no diplomas. One map on the wall, the West Coast, with certain cities marked in a pattern she didn't immediately understand. He was standing at the window when she came in. "You studied accounting," he said without turning. Not a question. "My father taught me, informally." "And you were 2 semesters from finishing an LPN. Licensed Practical Nursing." "Yes." She sat in one of the chairs without being invited to, because waiting to be invited would have communicated the wrong thing. "You said you have a problem." He turned. "My organization has been losing money for 14 months, not catastrophically, just steadily, in amounts small enough that they don't trigger immediate alarm." She felt the particular attention that certain problems produced in her, The narrowing of focus, the quickening. How much total? Best estimate, 3.2 million. Routing. He looked at her. What? Where's it going? Are the losses in the same accounts each cycle or rotating? Are they in cash flow or in investment vehicles? Do they look like errors or intentional transfers? He was quiet for a moment. You understood what I meant by that? Yes? Most people wouldn't. Most people weren't raised by a forensic accountant who made them read audit reports as bedtime stories. She met his eyes. Do you have the records here? Not here, off-site. Can you get them? He studied her for a long moment, and she held still under it, the way she'd learned to hold still under scrutiny. Not rigid, not defiant, just present, showing him she wasn't afraid of being looked at. Maybe, he said. The longer you wait, she said, the more whoever's doing this learns that you're not looking. He sat down behind the desk. How do you know someone's doing it? Because you said 14 months. Natural financial drift doesn't sustain at a consistent rate for 14 months. It corrects. What doesn't correct is intention. Something shifted very slightly in his expression. Not warmth, not surprise exactly, more like the subtle recalibration of a calculation. I'll have the records sent tomorrow morning, he said. She nodded. I'll need a workspace. The library. Works. She stood. One more thing. He waited. I'm going to help you because I have nowhere else to be right now, and because it's a genuinely interesting problem, she said. Not because I owe you anything. Not because of last night. Do you understand the difference? He looked at her for a long moment. Yes, he said. Good. She moved toward the door, then stopped. The 40,000. Was any of that debt real? He said nothing, which was, she understood, its own kind of answer, though she couldn't yet tell which way it went. She walked back to the library through the quiet corridor and sat in the reading chair by the window and watched the last of the light drain out of the ocean. The water was dark now, barely distinguishable from the sky. Somewhere down in the grounds, she could hear the men on rotation. The gap at the north corner would be there now, she knew, 90 seconds. She didn't think about the gap. She thought about $3.2 million and 14 months, and the particular kind of quiet that surrounded a man who had never once, in her presence, raised his voice. She opened her notebook, began a new page, wrote the number at the top, $3,200,000. 14 months. Consistent drain. Intentional. Beneath it, the first real question. Who inside the house has access? And beneath that, one more. The one that kept her up long after the lights went out, long after the ocean went fully black, long after the rotation outside had turned for the 5th time, and the night had settled deep into its bones. Why did he come for me specifically? The records arrived at 7:40 in the morning, carried by a man named Sal, who set a locked metal case on the library table without explanation and left without making eye contact with her. Serafina looked at the case for a moment, then went and got her coffee, then came back and opened it. Inside were 14 months of financial documentation for what appeared, on paper, to be a mid-sized import and logistics company headquartered in San Francisco. 12 folders, tabbed by month. Bank statements, wire transfer confirmations, vendor invoices, payroll summaries. Clean formatting. Professionally maintained. Too professionally maintained. She sat down and started from the beginning. By 9 o'clock, she had the first anomaly. By 10:30, she had 4. By noon, she had enough to understand the general shape of what she was looking at, and the shape was ugly in a very specific and practiced way. Ugly, the way things are when someone has spent a long time learning to make ugly things look clean. She went to find Moretti. He was in a meeting. One of his men, thick-necked, the kind of face that had been rearranged at least once in its life, stopped her in the corridor with a hand out, flat. He's busy. I need 5 minutes. He's busy. Tell him I found the first routing node. If he wants to wait, that's his business. The man looked at her with the particular expression of someone who has been handed a message they don't understand but can tell is important. He turned and knocked twice on the closed door, then went inside. Serafina waited. Through the door, she could hear nothing. It was that kind of door. 30 seconds later, it opened. Moretti stood in the frame. He wasn't looking at her. He was looking back over his shoulder at whoever was inside the room, and his expression was doing something complicated. Give us the room, he said to whoever was in there. Shuffling. Two men came out, neither of them meeting Serafina's eyes. One of them was large and gray-haired and moved with the cultivated ease of a man accustomed to being the most dangerous presence in any given space. He glanced at her as he passed, a quick sweep, dismissive but not without interest. And then he was gone. She went in. The room smelled like cigarette smoke that had been aired out repeatedly but never fully eliminated. You found something, Moretti said. 14 months of someone who is very good at their job, she said. She set her notebook on the table. She'd been filling it since 7:40, her handwriting small and dense. The money isn't being taken in lump sums. It's being distributed across what looks like normal operating expenses. Vendor payments, equipment leases, contracted labor. We noticed that. What you didn't notice, she said, is that 11 of the vendor accounts are shells. They accept payment and route it through 2 intermediate accounts before it lands somewhere clean. She tapped the page. Each shell has a real business address and a real tax ID. They're not invented. They're legitimate businesses that have been quietly purchased and repurposed. Moretti was very still. How long did that take to build? The oldest shell incorporation date I found was 22 months ago. She looked at him directly. Whoever did this started planning it 8 months before they started taking money. They weren't improvising. This was architected. The silence in the room was different from his usual silences, heavier. The man you saw leaving when you came in, he said finally. The gray-haired one. Marco Caruso, he's been my underboss for 11 years. He picked up the notebook, looked at it, set it back down. He manages the financial operations. Then he has the access. He has the access, Moretti said. That doesn't make him... I'm not telling you who did it, she said. I'm telling you where the access points are. Who used them is your question to answer. She paused. But whoever built this architecture understood your accounting systems from the inside, not the outside. The construction of these shells maps directly to gaps in your reconciliation cycle. They knew exactly when and where you weren't looking. Moretti walked to the window. He stood with his back to her for long enough that she could hear the sound of the ocean, faint and steady. How much have you found so far? He said. Confirmed routing, about 1.2 million. But the methodology scales. If the same pattern is applied to the accounts I haven't fully analyzed yet. She did the arithmetic she'd already done 3 times. It's closer to 3.5. He turned around. His face had changed, not visibly, not to anyone who didn't know to look for the minute tightening around his eyes. I told you 3.2. You underestimated, she said, or whoever gave you the preliminary estimate did. She held his gaze. One of those is more concerning than the other. He looked at her for a long moment. I need the full breakdown. I'll have it by tonight, maybe tomorrow morning for the outer accounts. She picked up the notebook. I need a printer and a second copy of the payroll records from months 7 through 11. The ones in the case are photocopies and 2 of them are partially overexposed. Claudia will get them. She was at the door when he spoke again. Serafina. She stopped. This doesn't go anywhere, he said. What you're finding, the people in this house, some of them have been with me for 15 years. I understand. Do you? She turned halfway. I'm not naive about what you're asking me to do. I'm not naive about what it means if I'm right about the architecture. She met his eyes. I'm also not going to slow down to make anyone comfortable. That's not what you brought me here for. He nodded, barely. No, he said. It's not. She walked back to the library, sat down, and opened the next folder. Her coffee had gone cold. She drank it anyway. The afternoon moved in the way that focused work makes time move. Not fast, not slow, but consumed. She stopped noticing the room. She stopped noticing the sounds from the rest of the house. There was only the paper in front of her, the numbers in her notebook, and the patient, ugly logic of what someone had built here in the dark over nearly 2 years. At 3 o'clock, the gray-haired man appeared in the library doorway. Marco Caruso. Up close, he was in his mid-60s, broad through the shoulders, with a face that had once been good-looking and had settled into something more interesting and more dangerous with age. He was holding a cup of espresso and looking at the case on the table with an expression she couldn't immediately classify. You're the girl from last night, he said. Serafina. Right. He came into the room without invitation, which she noted. What are you doing with those? Mr. Moretti asked me to review them. He asked you. The emphasis was light, professional, the kind of dismissal that doesn't commit to itself in case it needs to retreat. What kind of review? Financial. She didn't look up from the page she was working on. Reconciliation analysis. We have people for that. Apparently. She turned a page. Was there something you needed? She felt him looking at the notebook. She'd left it open on the table, but what was visible was a page of calculations rather than her written observations. Deliberate, a decision she'd made 2 hours ago when she'd considered the possibility that someone might come to look. Dante didn't mention bringing in outside help, Caruso said. You'd have to ask him about that. I'm asking you. She looked up. I don't explain his decisions. I just do the work he asks me to do. His eyes held hers for a beat longer than was comfortable and a beat shorter than was confrontational. The precision of it told her something about the kind of man he was. Someone who had spent decades living in spaces where every signal mattered, every gesture was read, every pause was a move in a game. How long have you known Dante? He said. Not long. Funny, he's not usually casual about who he lets into this house. I'm not sure I'd describe my situation as casual. She held his gaze steadily. Is there something specific you needed, Mr. Caruso? Because I'd like to finish this before dinner. He looked at the case one more time. His face was very still now, the ease of earlier replaced with something quieter and more careful. Just making sure our guest is comfortable, he said, and left. She listened to his footsteps move down the corridor. Then she picked up her pen and wrote, at the bottom of the observation page she'd kept turned away from him. He came to see how much I have. He left when he couldn't tell. Then, below that, he knows I'm looking. The realization didn't produce fear exactly. It produced a different kind of attention, a sharpened quality of awareness that she recognized from the nursing program. The way you felt in a clinical setting when a patient's vitals started trending in a direction you didn't like. Not panic. Heightened focus. She was in a house with the man she was investigating. He now knew she existed. He had more resources here than she did, more relationships, more history. And she had, by her estimate, found enough to build a credible preliminary case, but not enough to make it conclusive. She was in the middle, which was the most dangerous place to be. She worked faster. By 6 o'clock, she had the full architecture laid out in 12 pages of dense notation. 3.6 million, distributed across 11 shells, routed through 2 intermediate accounts in banks with famously opaque disclosure practices, and ultimately landing. She could trace it to a certain point and not further, but the point she could reach was damning enough, in an account that bore no relationship to any of Moretti's listed operations. She was numbering the pages when Moretti came to the library himself. He read in silence. She watched his face as he read, not intrusively, but steadily. This was the part of the work she'd always found most telling. Not the numbers themselves, but the faces of the people confronting them. Numbers were abstract until a human being had to hold their weight. His face, as he read, did not show much. But his hands, she noticed, were completely still on the pages in a way that hands usually weren't. Still in the particular way of someone who has made a physical decision not to move. He set the last page down. You said intermediate accounts, he said. Both of them. Yes. One of them is a holding company I set up 4 years ago for a real estate investment. It was inactive. I hadn't looked at it in 18 months. Someone knew it was inactive, she said. They used it as a layering point specifically because you wouldn't be monitoring it. How would they know it was inactive? She said nothing, because the answer was someone very close to him. His jaw tightened, briefly, and then relaxed. What do you need to go further on the destination account? Banking access I don't have and probably can't get it through legal channels. I have people who can access it through other channels. Then yes. She paused. I'd also want to look at communications, call logs, if you have them. The pattern of withdrawals accelerated in months 11 and 12. That kind of acceleration usually reflects an external pressure, a deadline, or a relationship changing. What kind of change? Something that made the person feel they were running out of time. She watched his face. Either they were about to be caught and decided to move faster, or something in their external situation changed. A new obligation, a new alliance. He picked up the last page again, the one with the destination routing. He looked at it for a long time. "I want to see Caruso's personal phone records for the last 6 months," he said quietly. Not to her, more like a man speaking a decision into existence. "If you do that," she said carefully, "he'll likely know. These things usually have tells." "I know." He set the page down. "Do you understand what you've done here?" "I followed the numbers." "You've handed me a reason to look at a man I've trusted for 11 years. His voice was even. "If you're wrong—" "I'm not wrong about the architecture," she said. "I'm not speculating about the shells. They exist. The routing exists. The documentation is there." She met his eyes. "What I can't tell you is whose hands built it. That's not what numbers tell." "But you think it's him?" She was quiet for a moment. "I think the person who built this had the access that he has, the institutional knowledge that he has, and the sophistication that he clearly has. I think those are facts." She paused. "I think you already think it's him, and you're hoping I'll tell you I'm wrong." Something moved across his face then, not pain exactly, but the near cousin of it, the expression of a man who has arrived somewhere he had hoped to avoid. "Stay in the library tonight," he said. "Don't walk the corridors." "Why?" "Because I'm going to have a conversation that may become loud." He picked up the stack of papers. "And I'd rather you not be in the middle of it." He left. She heard his footsteps, measured and unhurried, until the corridor swallowed them. She sat in the library and listened to the house. For 40 minutes, it was quiet. Then, from the far end of the building, muffled by stone and distance but undeniable, she heard voices. Not the words, just the shape of voices raised, the rhythm of confrontation, the peaks and valleys of men who are past the performance of civility. Then a silence that lasted long enough to become its own kind of noise. Then footsteps, multiple sets, fast, in the corridor. Then nothing. She had not moved from the chair. She realized her pen was still in her hand, lid off, held at an angle that would have smeared ink down her palm if she hadn't noticed. She capped it, set it down. Claudia appeared in the doorway at 9. Her face was arranged with professional care, but her eyes were doing something she couldn't fully suppress. "Mr. Moretti says dinner will be in your room tonight," she said. "What happened?" "I'm not in a position to—" "Claudia." Serafina kept her voice level. "What happened?" A pause, short but real. "There was a meeting. One of Mr. Moretti's associates left the property." She folded her hands. "Under significant disagreement." "Caruso." Claudia said nothing, which was its own answer. "Is Moretti all right?" "He's—" "Yes, he's occupied." She seemed to catch herself. "Dinner will be in your room. Please stay there tonight." Serafina nodded. The food came 20 minutes later. She ate very little of it. She sat at the window and watched the rotation of the men on the grounds, and noticed that there were now 4 of them instead of 2, and the pattern had changed, tighter, overlapping, the north corner blind spot closed by a 5th man she hadn't seen before. Whatever she'd put in motion today had changed the shape of this place. She opened her notebook to a fresh page and wrote the date. Then she sat looking at the blank lines beneath it, because she didn't yet know what to write, didn't know the shape of what had just happened or what it would set off. Caruso confronted, removed or left. 4 guards now, 5. Pattern changed. She thought about the acceleration of the withdrawals in months 11 and 12, the external pressure she'd theorized, the new alliance. If Caruso had known he was going to be caught, or had reason to fear it, then his departure tonight was not a disaster for him. It was a planned extraction. She underlined the word alliance twice. If Caruso had partners outside the organization, if those partners had known the investigation might come, if tonight's confrontation hadn't been a surprise to him at all, but a signal, a starting gun. She heard it before she registered what she was hearing, a sound she'd learned in the 2nd semester of nursing school, in a seminar on emergency response. The difference between a backfire and a gunshot when both are heard through walls and distance. 2 shots, separated by less than a second. Then silence. She was on her feet before the echo finished, heart slamming, the notebook in her hand for no reason at all, just something to hold. She went to the door, opened it, looked into the corridor. One of the rotation men, she'd learned his name was Felix from overhearing Claudia, was running past at full speed, radio in hand, face wiped clean of everything except the kind of urgency that forgets to disguise itself. Stay in your room, he said without stopping. What was that room? She stepped back inside. She stood in the center of it, thinking, because thinking was the only thing that made the adrenaline useful instead of just frightening. 2 shots. Inside the perimeter or outside? The sound had been muffled, which meant inside a structure, which meant the garage or the house itself. The rotation men had tightened tonight, 5 instead of 2, which meant someone had already anticipated an incursion. Caruso had partners. She'd been right about the alliance. The partners had moved tonight. Not tomorrow, not in a week. Tonight. The same night Caruso left. She wasn't looking at embezzlement anymore. This was a coordinated move. Financial drainage followed by operational strike. Someone wasn't just stealing from Dante Moretti. Someone was taking him apart piece by piece, and the pieces were coming loose faster now, and she was inside the structure while it came apart. Her door opened without a knock. Moretti. He had a cut above his left cheekbone. Not deep, but recent, the skin around it just beginning to swell. His jacket was gone. He was holding his phone in his right hand, and there was dried blood on 2 of his fingers that she was fairly certain was not his. She looked at his face. He looked at hers. You said external pressure, he said. His voice was perfectly controlled, which was, she understood, a significant effort. Partners outside. Yes. Caruso wasn't just stealing. He stepped into the room. He's been meeting with a rival operation out of San Diego for the past 8 months. 2 of my men just... He stopped, jaw tight. My security captain is dead. Shooter was already inside the perimeter, already inside. She made herself stay steady. Someone inside let them in. Yes. Who else has the access that Caruso had? That's what I'm trying to figure out. He looked at her with an expression that was stripped of the usual careful control. Not raw, exactly, but unguarded in the focused, urgent way of a man in the middle of something real. I need you to think. I am thinking. She sat down. Not because she was calm, but because thinking was easier without the energy cost of standing. The acceleration in months 11 and 12. I said external pressure, new obligation, new alliance. 8 months of meetings with a San Diego group aligns with month 6 of the financial pattern. That's when the pace increased. He was promising them something, or paying them something, the shell accounts, the destination we couldn't trace. That's where the money was going, not Caruso's personal accounts, an operational fund. She looked up. I wasn't stealing for himself. He was funding the group he was going to hand you over to. The room was very quiet. This is a takeover, Moretti said. This was always a takeover, she said. The embezzlement wasn't the point. It was the mechanism. Strip you of funds, compromise your operations from the inside, identify your security weaknesses, and then when you're destabilized enough, move. She paused. Tonight was supposed to be further down the line. You confronting Caruso accelerated their timeline. He sat down in the chair across from her. He pressed the back of his hand briefly against the cut on his cheek, looked at the blood on his knuckles, seemed to process neither. How do I know who's left in my organization that I can trust? You probably can't know for certain, not quickly. She met his eyes. But you can triangulate. Look at communication patterns. Who was in contact with whom in the last 8 months? Who had access to the security rotation schedule? That's how the shooter got inside. That's 6 people. Then you start with 6. She kept her voice steady, even though her heartbeat was nowhere near steady, and the cut above his eye was fresh enough that she could see the tissue was slightly raised, and she kept having to suppress the nurse brain that wanted to talk about sterile closure. The communication records. Can you pull them? Yes. Tonight? He looked at her for a moment. You want to work tonight. Your security captain is dead, she said plainly. Whoever gave the shooter access is still in this house, or was in this house 4 hours ago, or was in contact with someone who was. Yes. I want to work tonight. Something moved in his expression. Not warmth. This was not a warm situation, but something. A recognition of some kind. The library, he said. I'll have the records pulled. And someone needs to look at that cut, she said. It should be closed. You have shallow tissue trauma, and it's going to swell badly by morning if you leave it. He touched his cheek briefly, like a man who had genuinely forgotten it was there. Claudia, I can do it faster. Do you have a first aid kit in this building, or are we improvising? He looked at her. There's a medical cabinet in the gym. Get it and come to the library, she said. Then we work. She was already moving to the door. Behind her, she heard him let out a breath, barely audible, the exhalation of a man who had just placed weight somewhere and was deciding whether it would hold. She didn't wait to see if he followed. She walked to the library, turned on every light, opened her notebook to the page with the 6-month communication framework she'd already begun sketching in her head, and sat down. The house outside the door was full of the sounds of men moving fast and speaking low, and the particular charged atmosphere of an organization that has just discovered it is bleeding and does not yet know how deep the wound goes. She uncapped her pen. She was not safe here. She understood that clearly, the way you understand a medical fact, with precision, without the luxury of denial. She was inside a compound that had just been penetrated. The man she was working with had enemies who were organized, funded, and patient. She had nowhere to go and no resources outside this room and no protection except the mind. She'd been told her whole life was inconvenient. She put the pen to the page. Communication pattern analysis. 6 individuals with schedule access. Cross-reference against Caruso's known meeting dates. She had been sold into this house 6 days ago, and somewhere between the cold coffee and the 12 folders and the library window and the sound of 2 gunshots in the dark, she had stopped waiting to be rescued. No one was coming. She was the one doing the coming. She wrote the first name on the list and circled it, and the pen moved cleanly on the page, and outside the window the ocean pressed against the cliffs in the dark, indifferent and endless. And inside the library the lights burned steady and bright against everything outside that was trying to go wrong. Moretti came to the library with the medical cabinet under his arm and the communication records in a folder, and the expression of a man who had made a decision about where to put his energy and had chosen forward. Serafina cleared the end of the table without being asked. He set the cabinet down and opened it. She looked through it quickly. Gauze, antiseptic, butterfly closures, saline, basic but adequate. "Sit," she said. He sat. He was not, she noticed, a man who accepted direction easily. There was a brief moment where his body registered mild resistance before his mind overruled it. But he sat. She tilted his chin up slightly with 2 fingers and examined the cut in the light. 1.5 inches, clean edges, shallow. The tissue around it was already purpling. She opened the saline and a square of gauze without speaking, and he held still, which she appreciated because men who flinched during wound care were exhausting. "This is going to sting," she said. "Do it." It did. He didn't flinch. She cleaned it thoroughly, pressed 2 butterfly closures across the gap, taped the edges of the gauze down flat. "You'll have a bruise for 10 days, she said. "It won't need stitches if you don't touch it. I won't touch it. You touched it 4 times in the last 20 minutes. He said nothing. She closed the cabinet and moved to the other side of the table and opened her notebook. "The 6 names, she said. "Talk me through each one." He opened the folder, and they worked. It was past 2 in the morning before the picture became clear enough to name. His name was Trent Hadley, 31 years old, 3 years with Moretti's operation, originally hired to manage the digital communications infrastructure, quiet, competent, the kind of person who became invisible through usefulness, which was, Serafina had learned in the last 6 hours, the best possible camouflage in any organization. Hadley's communication pattern was damning in the way that well-constructed lies always eventually were. Too clean. Every contact logged, every message accounted for, the digital record of a man who knew it was going to be scrutinized and had therefore made it look impeccable. Except that impeccable, in a world where everyone operated under at least some level of informal chaos, was its own kind of flag. He wiped his personal device twice in the last 4 months, Moretti said. He was reading from a technical report his people had pulled. His voice was flat with tiredness but precise. Both wipes logged as routine maintenance. But the timing, she tapped her notes. Both wipes fall within 48 hours of confirmed Caruso external meetings. It wasn't maintaining his device, he was clearing handoff records. He's the one who scheduled the rotation change tonight. She looked up. He changed the rotation. 2 days ago. Said it was a response to a general security concern. Moretti's jaw tightened. I approved it without looking at the specifics. The rotation change created the window the shooter used. Yes. She wrote Hadley at the top of a new page, underlined it twice, and felt the particular cold clarity that came when a complex thing resolved into a simple shape. It wasn't satisfaction. Satisfaction would have been indecent given what the shape meant. A man was dead. An organization had been penetrated. Someone who'd sat in the same rooms as Dante Moretti for 3 years had been systematically working to dismantle everything around him. "Where's Hadley now?" she said. "On the property. Guest quarters, on the east side. My men brought everyone not on active duty in when the shooting started." He paused. "He doesn't know we've connected him." "Don't tell him yet." "I know." "And Caruso? Do you know where he went?" "My people are working on it." The restraint in his voice was doing significant work. He had a car waiting outside the north wall, planned. He knew the rotation change would keep the north corner clear long enough. He looked at her. "The gap you noted in your notebook your first morning. He used it." She was still for a moment. "You read my notebook. Claudia told me you'd been mapping the grounds." His voice carried no apology. "I needed to know what you'd observed." She absorbed this. She thought about being angry and decided anger was a luxury she couldn't afford at 2 in the morning, with a dead man somewhere in this building and a mole still breathing in the east wing. She filed it for later. "The San Diego operation," she said. You said rival syndicate. How large?" "Eduardo Reyes, he runs the west coast south of Los Angeles. Significant resources. Has been trying to expand north for 7 years." He paused. "I've blocked him twice in legitimate ways. Territory agreements with allied operations, financial arrangements that made his expansion economically unviable. He apparently decided a different approach was warranted. A 7-year operation," she said. "He's been planning this for 7 years. Caruso's been with me for 11. It's possible Reyes had contact with him before I did." He said it without visible emotion, which she was learning meant the emotion was significant. Or Reyes turned him somewhere along the way. She thought about it. "The timing of the first shell incorporations, 22 months ago. Does anything significant happen in Moretti's operation around that time?" He was quiet for a moment, thinking. "There was a reorganization. I moved certain financial oversight functions under Caruso's direct authority. Previously, they'd been divided across 3 people. He consolidated control and then immediately started building the infrastructure." She looked at her notes. Reyes gave him the opportunity, and he took it. Or Reyes created the opportunity deliberately. She paused. "Does Reyes know Caruso is out?" "By now, yes." "Then we have a problem." "We have several. The specific problem I mean is this." She turned the notebook so he could see the timeline she'd sketched in the last hour. Caruso's removal was not in the original planned schedule. He was supposed to be inside the organization when the final move came, coordinating from within while Reyes moved from outside. His early exit creates a gap in Reyes's operational plan. She watched his face. Gaps make people move faster than they intended to. Reyes is going to accelerate. Moretti leaned forward, elbows on the table, hands loosely clasped. He looked at the timeline. "How fast?" he said. "Days, not weeks." She paused. "Maybe less." He looked at her. Something in his expression had shifted in the course of the night. Not softened, because that word implied a loss of sharpness, and he was as sharp as he'd been at 2 in the afternoon. But the particular controlled distance had changed into something more direct. She was not sure exactly when it had happened. "Get some sleep," he said. 3 hours. Then we continue." "You should sleep too." "I have things to manage." "You have a head wound, and you've been awake for—" She stopped herself, recalibrated. "Fine. 3 hours." She went to her room. She did not sleep. She lay on the clean bed in the quiet room and stared at the ceiling and thought about a man named Eduardo Reyes who had spent 7 years building a path through someone else's life, and about a man named Caruso who had used 11 years of trust like a slow poison, and about a 31-year-old communications technician asleep in the East Wing who had opened a door in a fence and let a killer in. And she thought, underneath all of it, about the question she still hadn't answered, the one she'd written on her first morning. Why did he come for me specifically? She was back in the library at 5:15. Moretti arrived at 5:40. He'd changed his shirt. The butterfly closures were still in place, which meant he'd listened about not touching the cut, which surprised her slightly. He handed her a coffee without comment. She took it. "Hadley?" he said. "Yes." My men want to bring him in for questioning. Not yet. She wrapped both hands around the coffee mug. If we pull him in now, we get whatever story he's prepared. And he's prepared one. He's been prepared for this moment since the first rotation change. She paused. Let him think he's invisible for one more day. Let him make a contact. You want to trace the contact. I want to see who he calls when he thinks it's safe to call them. Moretti looked at her steadily. My men have been doing this for 20 years. I know. She met his eyes. And they're good at it. But the financial architecture that Caruso built was designed to defeat exactly their methods. Whoever's advising Reyes understands your operational patterns at a level that suggests detailed inside knowledge. If we use standard protocol, they'll see it. And if we use you instead, I'm not standard protocol. He held her gaze for a moment, then almost imperceptibly, he nodded. They had 4 hours before the next problem arrived, though neither of them knew that yet. The problem arrived in the form of a young man named Danny Rourke, 24 years old, who appeared at the library door at 9 in the morning, looking like he hadn't slept and wasn't sure if he was about to be shot. He had the kind of face that communicated everything against his will. Guilt wore on it like a weather condition, visible from across the room. He looked at Moretti. He looked at Serafina. He swallowed. I need to tell you something, he said. Moretti said nothing. The silence he produced was specifically the kind that made people feel it. About Hadley, Danny said. About... I did. Serafina kept her face neutral, with some effort. She set her pen down slowly. Sit down, Moretti said. Very quiet. The quietest she'd heard him. Danny sat down across the table from them both. He had his hands flat on his thighs, and he was breathing in the careful way of someone managing physical fear. He was young enough that the fear was written in his whole body. His shoulders were up, his neck was tight, the set of his jaw was the effort of someone trying to look more composed than they were. How long have you been in contact with Hadley? Moretti said. He came to me 6 months ago. And you agreed to He said it was going to happen regardless. The words came out faster now, the dam giving way. He said you were going to lose the territory war with Reyes no matter what. That Reyes had resources you couldn't match. That the people who stayed loyal were going to go down with the organization. He stopped, pressed his lips together. He said if I helped, just a few things, just passing along some scheduling information, that I'd be protected when the transition happened. Serafina looked at the boy across the table. He was 24 years old and he was terrified, and he had done something catastrophic for the most ordinary reason in the world. He'd been scared, and someone had offered him safety. The rotation schedule, Moretti said. I told Hadley your security captain's standard coverage area, the days he'd be running the east perimeter. His voice had dropped. I didn't know what they were going to do with it. I thought it was just information, movement patterns. And when you heard the shots last night, Danny's eyes went wet and he made himself not look away. I knew, he said. I knew what I'd done. The room was completely still. Serafina watched Moretti. She watched the line of his shoulders and the stillness of his hands and the particular quality of his expression, which was the expression of a man containing something large and combustible inside a very small space. Get out of this room, Moretti said. Wait in the hallway. Don't move. Danny stood. His legs were shaking visibly. He went to the hallway. Moretti stood at the window with his back to her for a full minute. She didn't speak. She understood that this was not the moment for analysis. He's a kid, she said finally, not defending, just naming. He helped kill a man who'd been with me for 15 years. He was manipulated by someone who knew exactly what kind of fear would work on him. She paused. That doesn't remove his responsibility. It changes the context. The context doesn't bring Sal back. She had not known the security captain's name was Sal. She absorbed it. No, it doesn't. He turned around. His face had settled back into the controlled arrangement, but the effort of it was visible in a way it usually wasn't. What do I do with him? She blinked. She had not expected the question to be directed at her. He came forward voluntarily. He gave you Hadley's name and methodology without being asked. That's either guilt or fear or both. She looked at the door. He also gave you the last piece of the picture you were missing. That's not an answer. I know, it's not my answer to give. She looked at him. But he's also the only person in this building who can walk up to Hadley without being flagged. The only person Hadley still trusts. Moretti was quiet for a moment. You want to use him? I want to offer him a way to partially repair what he did, she said. Whether that's your decision to allow is separate from whether it's tactically sound. She paused. It is tactically sound. Another silence, long enough that she heard the ocean. Fine, he said. He went to the door and opened it and looked at Danny in the hallway. You're going to do exactly what she tells you, every detail. You deviate by one step, and there won't be enough time for you to explain why. Danny nodded. His face was the face of a man who had expected worse and wasn't sure whether the relief he felt was warranted. Serafina spent the next 2 hours with Danny Rourke, reconstructing exactly what Hadley had asked for, how they communicated, what protocols Hadley had in place. Danny was meticulous in the way of someone trying to be maximally useful as an act of ongoing apology. He gave her everything. At noon, she had enough to build a communication trap. She explained it to Moretti in 4 sentences. I set Hadley a problem he'll need to call Reyes about, she said. I seed false information into the system through a channel Hadley monitors. The information will look like a significant security decision is being made today. He'll need to report it. When he makes contact, we trace it. How long do we have before he makes the contact? Within 4 hours of seeing the information. He'll be under pressure to report quickly. Reyes will have him on a short timeline given Caruso's early exit. And you can track the trace to Reyes' direct line. I can track it to an account. Your people can take it from there. He nodded. Do it. She did it. She seeded the information through a channel she'd identified in Hadley's monitoring pattern, a secondary scheduling system that he'd set up access to quietly 6 months ago. The false information was specific enough to be credible and important enough to demand urgent reporting. A fictional meeting between Moretti and 2 allied operation heads scheduled for 2 days out at a location that would be highly significant if true. Then she waited. 2 hours and 17 minutes later, Hadley made the call. Moretti's technical team traced it in 11 minutes. Not to a direct line, to an encrypted relay that bounced across 4 servers, but the final destination resolved to a registered business address in San Diego. A medical consultation group, professionally maintained website. 3 listed principals, none of whom appeared to exist in any other contact registration. When she noticed the incorporation date, her stomach dropped. She looked at it again, read it again, checked it against the timeline in her notebook. The medical consultation group had been incorporated 7 years ago, the same time Reyes had begun his first expansion attempt, which she'd already known, and that part was not the problem. The problem was the attorney of record on the incorporation document. She recognized the name because she'd seen it before. Not in these records. In different records, older records, personal ones, the kind a daughter would have access to when settling her father's affairs. Her father's estate had been handled by a firm. After he died, when she was 17, when the accounts were transferred to Miranda and she'd had no standing to contest any of it, she had sat in a lawyer's office and signed documents and not fully understood what she was signing. The lawyer had been patient and kind, and she'd remembered him because of that, because kindness in that period had been unusual. His name was on this incorporation document, which meant he had been working for Eduardo Reyes for 7 years, which meant he had also been the attorney who processed her father's estate, which meant that her father's estate, the accounts, the assets, the insurance policy that had been the only thing of material value Thomas Vale had left behind, had been processed by a man who worked for the operation that had just tried to kill Dante Moretti. She sat very still. Her father had been an accountant, a forensic accountant. She described him that way to Moretti without thinking about it, raised by a forensic accountant who made her read audit reports as bedtime stories. She'd said it lightly, as shorthand for the skills she had. But forensic accountants were hired to investigate financial crimes. They found things people wanted unfound. They built cases. They testified. They were dangerous to the people whose records they analyzed. Her father had died 6 years ago. A cardiac event, sudden, in his office. He was 51 and in decent health, and the autopsy had shown what autopsies showed. Coronary occlusion, no external factors, the ordinary machinery of a body failing without warning. She had never questioned it. She had grieved it and lived inside it and moved forward from it because there was nothing else to do. She was questioning it now. Her hands were flat on the table. She could see them from a slight distance, as though her mind had stepped briefly out of her body to observe the situation from a safer angle. Her hands were perfectly steady, which surprised her. Numbers tell stories, her father used to say. You just have to speak the language. She spoke the language. And the story these numbers were beginning to tell was one she was not sure she had the structural capacity to hold without something cracking. She made herself breathe. In through the nose. Slow. Her father had been investigating something. He had found it, or been close to finding it, or had already documented it. Someone connected to Eduardo Reyes had known. The attorney who handled his estate afterward, who had processed the transfer of every asset to a woman who had spent 6 years reducing her stepdaughter to a balance sheet item, had been on Reyes's payroll. Miranda hadn't fabricated the debt out of cruelty alone. Miranda had been placed, not recruited, exactly, not paid like an agent, but managed. The debts, the document, the sale, these were not the actions of a greedy woman acting alone. They were the actions of a greedy woman who had been given an opportunity and the legal architecture to execute it, by a lawyer who had an interest in ensuring that Thomas Vale's daughter ended up as far from any investigative capacity as possible. Sold to a crime lord, stripped of resources, documentation, legal standing, family connection, made into a debt rather than a daughter. Serafina sat in the library of Dante Moretti's estate and understood, with a precision that was almost surgical, that her entire life for the past 6 years had been a managed outcome. She heard footsteps in the corridor. She closed the incorporation document. She closed her notebook on top of it. She arranged her face. Moretti came in. "We have the relay data," he said. "My people are working the chain back to Reyes's infrastructure. It'll take—" He stopped. He looked at her face. "What?" "Sit down," she said. He sat. She opened the notebook. She did not look at him while she began to explain, because looking at him would have used energy she needed for the words, and the words needed to be precise, and she was holding something enormous in her chest that required most of her available capacity just to contain. She told him about the attorney, about the incorporation date, about her father, about what she thought it meant. He listened without interrupting. His face did the thing it did when it was holding something large. The stillness, the particular quality of absolute attention that was the opposite of blankness. When she finished, the room was very quiet. "Your father was investigating Reyes," he said. Not a question. "I think so. I don't know what he found. I don't know if he documented it." She paused. "I don't know if it still exists somewhere. How would Reyes have known?" The attorney. "If my father was using that firm consulting with that attorney on a professional matter, if he'd found shell structures like the ones I found yesterday and needed legal guidance on how to document them formally." She stopped. "He would have told his lawyer what he had." Moretti was looking at the notebook. "Reyes had your father killed." She heard it spoken plainly in another person's voice and felt the precise moment her chest did something complicated and irreversible. "I think it's possible," she said. Her voice was even. She was proud of that. She was furious at herself for being proud of that, for the survival habit of composure that had gotten her through 6 years of Miranda and would now apparently get her through this too. And then had your position managed to neutralize any risk you represented, to prevent me from ever having the resources or the standing to investigate. She paused. Which worked. For 6 years it worked perfectly. He looked at her directly. Until your stepmother got greedy. Until Miranda decided to monetize the debt instead of just maintaining it. She met his eyes. She wasn't supposed to sell me to you. She was supposed to keep me small and broke and contained. Selling me was her improvisation, her mistake. She held his gaze. And Reyes didn't know I was here until... She stopped. She went back through the timeline, fast. The way her mind moved through numbers, through patterns, through the logic of sequence and causation. Caruso had known she was here. Caruso had come to the library that first afternoon to assess her. Caruso had known, within 24 hours of her arrival, that Moretti had brought in an outside financial analyst. Caruso reported to Reyes. She looked at Moretti. "Reyes knows I'm here," she said. "He's known since day 2, maybe day 1. Moretti said nothing. "The acceleration," she said. "You asked me why Reyes moved faster after Caruso's exit. I said it was because Caruso's removal created a gap." She paused. "That's partially true. But the other reason, the reason they moved last night specifically, the reason the timeline compressed, is because Reyes knows what I found. Caruso told him, and Reyes understood that if I kept going, his entire financial architecture would be fully mapped and documented within days. She let it land. They didn't shoot your security captain because of Caruso's removal, she said. They shot him because of me, because I was getting too close too fast, and someone decided the timeline needed to move now, while the operation still had a chance. The silence that followed was the longest one yet. Moretti stood up from his chair. He went to the window. He stood with his back to her, and she watched the set of his shoulders and the way his hands were at his sides, not moving. She had just told him that she was the proximate cause of Sal's death. She had told him that her presence in this house had accelerated an attack that killed a man who had been with him for 15 years. She had told him this clearly and without softening it, because she did not believe in softening facts, and because he deserved to know the full shape of what he was dealing with. She waited. "You didn't cause it," he said, to the window. My presence, Reyes was going to move regardless. The timeline was always going to compress when Caruso left. He turned. "You being here changed the speed, not the direction. Sal is still dead." "Yes." Something crossed his face, grief, real and undecorated, the kind that doesn't perform itself. "He is." She looked at her hands on the notebook. "I want to find my father's documentation," she said. "Whatever he had, whatever he built before he died. If it still exists, if he archived it somewhere, it could give us Reyes directly. Not the financial trail I've been building, something older, something that predates all the shell cleanup he's had 7 years to perform." Moretti looked at her. "You think it survived?" "He was a forensic accountant. He didn't keep single copies of things." She paused. "I know his methods. I know where he would have archived. If the documentation exists anywhere, I can find it." She met his eyes. "But I need to go somewhere. I can't do it from here." "Where?" "There's a storage facility in Oakland. He rented a unit there for 20 years. The same unit, same company, automatically renewed. I was the secondary contact on the rental. Miranda never knew about it because she never went through his professional records carefully enough to find the direct debit." She paused. "I need to go to Oakland." He looked at her for a long moment. The weight of every calculation behind his eyes was visible, all of it happening at once. The risk, the exposure, the fact that going outside this compound with Reyes's people now mobilized and looking for exactly this kind of movement was a significant tactical problem. "If Reyes thinks you have what your father documented," he said slowly, "then going to Oakland makes you—" "A target," she said. "I know. You'd be walking into exactly what he'd expect." "Yes." She held his gaze. "But if I don't go, and the documentation exists, and Reyes cleanses the financial trail in the next week, which he will, because he knows I'm mapping it, and he knows I'm getting close, then we lose the only evidence that predates his cleanup operation." She let a breath out. "I know the math, Moretti. I don't love the math, but the math is the math." He looked at her steadily, and she looked back at him because she had stopped, somewhere between the second night and this morning, being afraid of what she'd find when she met his eyes directly. What she found right now was a man who was about to make a decision he didn't want to make. "Tomorrow morning," he said. 6:15, small team, 2 cars. You stay between them the entire route." She nodded. "And Serafina?" He held her gaze. "What your father found. What he died for. If it's in that unit." He paused, and for a moment the careful architecture of his control carried something underneath it that she recognized because she felt it too. The specific weight of a loss that had been reframed overnight from ordinary tragedy into something far darker and far less acceptable. "We use every piece of it." "Every piece," she said. She picked up her pen and opened the notebook to a fresh page, and the library was quiet around her except for the distant sound of the ocean pressing against the cliffs in the gray morning light. And somewhere in San Diego, a man named Eduardo Reyes was making his own calculations. And for the first time since her father's funeral, she understood with absolute clarity that grief and fury, properly directed, were not weaknesses at all. They were the sharpest tools she had. They left at 6:15 exactly, the sky still dark at the edges, and the coast road empty in both directions. 2 black vehicles, 4 men distributed between them, and Serafina in the rear seat of the lead car with her notebook in her lap and a borrowed phone in her jacket pocket, and the particular clarity of mind that came when fear had been metabolized into something functional. Moretti was in the vehicle behind, his decision, not hers. She'd assumed he would stay at the compound and coordinate from there, and when he appeared in the motor court at 6:12 with his jacket and the expression of a man who had already settled the argument with himself, she had not questioned it. She was learning which silences were his form of explanation. The drive to Oakland was 4 hours in light traffic. They made it in 3:40 with Felix driving at a pace that rendered the speed limit hypothetical. Nobody spoke much. One of the men in the front, broad-shouldered, maybe 40, she'd heard him called Ren, kept his eyes on the side mirror with the steady, unhurried attention of a man who'd been doing surveillance work long enough that it had stopped requiring concentration and become pure reflex. 40 minutes outside Oakland, Ren said without turning. Blue sedan, 3 cars back. Been with us since the interchange. She felt her chest tighten. She did not look behind her. How long? Felix said. 20 minutes. Maybe 22. Felix's hands didn't move on the wheel. He touched the radio. Said 2 words to the car behind. The second vehicle's response was a brief click. Acknowledged. 1 tail or more, she said. 1 visible, Ren said. Doesn't mean 1 total. She absorbed this. They're not going to move on the highway. No, they want the destination, which meant they already knew or suspected where she was going, which meant Reyes had either had her father's storage unit under some form of monitoring for years, possible if he'd known about the unit and had been waiting for someone to access it, or Caruso had known more about her background than she'd realized and had passed it along. She opened her notebook. If we go to the unit with a tail, we lead them directly to whatever's there. Then we lose the tail first, Felix said. Simply. Like losing a surveillance vehicle at highway speed was a scheduling adjustment. And if we can't, we can. She didn't debate it. She closed the notebook and held still and let the men in the car do the thing they clearly knew how to do. What followed was 11 minutes of driving that she would not have been able to describe in sequence afterward. Lane changes that felt casual but weren't. An exit taken at a speed that required all 4 tires to have strong opinions about their own existence. A surface street, a warehouse district, 2 lefts and a right, and then a stop in an alley behind a building that appeared to be a cold storage facility. Felix cut the engine. The second vehicle was already there. It had come a different way. She looked out the rear window. The alley was empty. Blue sedan, she said. Lost it at the exit, Ren said. For now. For now, he agreed. Moretti got out of the second car and came to hers. She opened the door before he reached it. They stood in the alley, the morning coming on gray and cool, the smell of salt water and diesel and something cold she couldn't name. They knew the direction, she said. Yes. Which means Reyes has had some form of watch on this area, either on the unit itself or on transit routes north. She paused. He knew about the storage unit. Then there's something in it worth finding. Or he's been monitoring it for years to make sure no one accessed it. She held his gaze. Both of those are significant, but they're different problems. Go, he said. Get what's there, fast. She got back in the car and they drove the last 6 blocks to the storage facility. It was a 3-story building in a light industrial area, the kind of place that had been there since the 80s and had simply continued existing through all the economic cycles that had redesigned the neighborhood around it. The signage was old. The door locks were new. She had her father's unit number memorized. B14. Second floor, north end. She'd never accessed it. Not after his death, not in the 6 years since. She'd kept the rental current through an automatic bank transfer that Miranda had never located because it ran from a small account Thomas Vale had opened in his daughter's name when she was 12, an account that held the same $300 it had held when he set it up, earning minimal interest and doing nothing except paying 1 monthly charge. She'd always told herself she wasn't ready to go through his things. Now she understood she'd been waiting, without knowing it, for a reason that justified the weight of what she might find. The elevator was slow and smelled like industrial cleaner. Felix went first, Ren behind her. The corridor on the second floor was fluorescent lit and quiet, the unit doors orange and gray, the locks heavy. She walked to B14 and stood in front of it and took 1 breath. She used the key she'd kept on her keychain for 6 years. It opened on the first try. The unit was roughly the size of a large walk-in closet. It was full. Not haphazardly full. Her father did not do haphazard. It was organized with the same methodical logic as the library at Moretti's estate. And seeing that familiar organizational system in this unfamiliar space produced a sensation in her chest that she didn't have time to examine. Metal shelving on 3 walls. Boxes labeled by year and category. A locked fireproof cabinet in the corner that she was fairly certain had never been cataloged in any of his estate documents. "I need 15 minutes," she said. "You have 8, Felix said from the door. She moved. She went to the fireproof cabinet first. The key for it was the same key as the unit. Her father had been a man who understood that the best hiding place was the most obvious one, the one that looked like it had already been accounted for. Inside the cabinet were 3 accordion files and a USB drive taped to the inside of the door. She took all of it, shoved it into the bag she'd brought. Then she went to the shelving. The years were labeled on the outside of each box. She went backward from the year her father died, found the box marked with that year and the one preceding it, and pulled them both. Heavy. She'd need to go through them later, but she didn't have later. She had 4 minutes by now, so she took the boxes whole. She was reaching for a third box when she found the envelope. It was taped to the underside of the shelf. She wouldn't have seen it if she hadn't been crouching to reach the bottom row, wouldn't have found it if she hadn't run her hand along the metal surface out of instinct, out of the deep habitual thoroughness her father had instilled in her. Always check what's underneath. Numbers hide in margins. Look where nobody else thinks to look. Sealed envelope, her name on the front in her father's handwriting. The ink had yellowed slightly with time. She stood up, put it in the bag without opening it. Her hands were not shaking, which required an active decision. "Time," Felix said. "Coming." She took one more look at the unit, at the shelves, at the cabinet, at the years and years of her father's meticulous documented life. She could not take all of it. She took what she judged to be the most critical, and she walked out and pulled the door shut and heard the lock click and went back down the corridor toward the elevator. They were back in the car in 4 minutes. 3 blocks from the facility, Ren said. 2 vehicles, different from this morning. She looked up from the bag in her lap. "Where?" "East and north. They've boxed the street." Felix was already on the radio. The second car responded immediately. 4 words. "We don't have a clean exit," Felix said. Not panicked, analytical. "If they close the box, they won't move until they know we have what we came for," she said. She was thinking fast, the kind of fast that felt like her mind was several seconds ahead of her mouth. "They've been watching the unit. They know we accessed it. They're going to want to recover whatever we took before we can transmit it or secure it." "So we need to transmit it," Moretti said from behind her. She turned. He had the expression of a man who was already ahead of her. "The USB drive," she said. "If I can copy whatever's on it." "Not here. No secure connection." He already had his phone out. "But I can have it received at our end. Encrypted transfer. If you plug that drive into anything with a network." "I don't have anything with a network." Ren reached into the console and produced a laptop. "This does." She stared at it for half a second, then took it, pulled out the USB, plugged it in. The drive contained 37 files, organized by subject. The file names were coded, her father's shorthand, a system he'd explained to her when she was 15, letters and numbers that looked like nothing to anyone who didn't know the key. She knew the key. The file marked with the sequence that meant primary documentation. First tier was a spreadsheet 48 pages long. She opened it and saw the first column and felt the air leave her lungs in a single involuntary movement. The first entry was dated 8 years ago. The client name was redacted, but the financial institution was named, and the shell structure documented in the first 12 rows was identical. Identical in architecture, in methodology, in the specific gap exploitation technique, to the system she had spent the last week analyzing in Moretti's records. Not similar. Identical. Same architect. Same methodology, refined over additional years applied to a larger and more sophisticated target. Her father had found this. Her father had built the case. Her father had documented 8 years ago what she had re-derived from scratch in 6 days. And then her father had died. "Plug the laptop into the car's satellite connection," Moretti said. He was leaning forward, reading over her shoulder. His voice was completely controlled. "We transmit everything now. If I transmit, now." Felix opened the center console, produced a cable. Ren took the laptop, connected it. 8 seconds of system handshake. Then a window opened showing a secure transfer protocol that she didn't recognize but that Moretti clearly did because he reached past her, entered a credential sequence from memory, and initiated the transfer. 37 files. Estimated transfer time, 4 minutes. They're moving, Ren said. She looked up. Both vehicles, the ones from the east and north, were closing. Felix, Moretti said. Felix drove. What happened next occupied 4 minutes and 20 seconds of her life that would leave a permanent physical memory in her body. The kind of experience that bypasses conscious processing and writes itself directly into the nervous system. The car moved at speeds that made thought structural rather than verbal. She was holding the laptop with both hands because it had the transfer window open and she needed it to stay connected, and also because having something to hold meant her hands were doing a thing rather than being useless. The bag with her father's files was jammed between her feet. Transfer at 60%, 70. The second vehicle behind them kept pace. She could hear radio traffic, short and operational, the men communicating in the shorthand of people who'd done this before and would do it again, and whose professionalism in this moment she was genuinely grateful for, in a way she'd think about later and not now. 80%. One of the pursuing vehicles closed the gap on the right. She heard an impact, not a collision, a contact, the sound of metal acknowledging metal at speed, and the car she was in moved 2 feet sideways before Felix corrected with a precision that felt almost contemptuous. 90%. Moretti, she said, I see it. If the transfer completes and they recover the physical drive, the drive becomes irrelevant. Then we need to make sure it completes. It's going to complete. It completed at 97.4%, generating an error on the final fraction of the last file, and then the window showed transfer confirmed, receiving end secured, and she pulled the drive from the port and held it in her fist. Felix took a turn that the physics of the situation had opinions about, and they came out on a wider road, and the pursuing vehicles were not immediately behind them, and Ren said 2 words into the radio that she took to mean clear for now. She became aware that she was breathing in sharp, shallow pulls, and made herself slow it down. In, out. The laptop screen showed the transfer confirmation. The drive was in her hand. The bag with her father's files was still between her feet, intact. Where are we going? She said. Not back to the compound, Moretti said. They know the route now. We use the secondary location. Where? Inland. 2 hours. He was already on his phone. The files are received and secured. My financial team is opening them now. She looked at the drive in her palm, closed her fingers around it. There's an envelope, she said. In the bag. My name on it. My father's handwriting. He said nothing. I'm going to read it, she said. I need you to not watch me read it. A pause. All right. She reached into the bag and found the envelope by feel. She didn't look at it first. She held it for a moment, feeling the slight stiffness of aged paper and the faint irregularity of the tape that had held it under a metal shelf for 6 years. Then she opened it. Her father's handwriting covered 3 pages, small and dense, the handwriting of a man who had a lot to say and limited space and had made that work. She read it. She read it again. By the second reading, her face was doing something she wasn't able to control, and she was glad Moretti had kept his word and was looking out the window. Thomas Vale had known. He had known, 14 months before his death, that the documentation he was building was dangerous. He had known because the client who'd brought him the case, an anonymous referral, passed through a third party, structured from the beginning in a way that gave him no direct contact information, had sent him a message after the first 3 months of work. Not a threat. Something worse than a threat. A proof. A single page demonstrating that the person who'd hired him knew everything about his life. His office location, his daughter's school, the route he drove every morning. A message that said, in unambiguous professional language, we know what you know. We know where you are. This can stop at any time. Thomas Vale had not stopped. He had accelerated. He had completed the documentation, archived it in 3 locations he identified in the letter, and written to his daughter, who was 17 at the time, who had no way of accessing the letter or understanding its contents, a 3-page explanation of what he'd found, why it mattered, and where to look if something happened to him. He had written, "I know this may be too much for you to find. I know you may never find it at all. But you are the only person I trust with this, because you are the only person who knows my methods well enough to understand what you're looking at. You are smarter than I am, Sarah. You always have been. If you find this, if it comes to that, then I want you to know that I wasn't careless. I saw it coming. I made a choice anyway." She folded the letter. She put it back in the envelope. She pressed the envelope flat against her thigh with the heel of her hand and breathed. Her father had made a choice. He had chosen the documentation over his own safety. He had trusted her, 17 and oblivious, and not yet the person she would eventually need to be, to find what he'd left. It had taken 6 years. It had taken being sold like a debt. It had taken a dead security captain and a shot fired in the dark, and a library at 2 in the morning, and a 4-hour drive into a city that was now full of people who wanted to recover what she was holding. She looked at the drive in her other hand. "Moretti," she said. "Yes." "My father documented the original shell structure 8 years ago. The same architect, the same methodology. Reyes has had 7 years to clean the trail. But he couldn't clean what my father built before the cleanup. The original documentation predates every measure Reyes has taken to make himself untraceable. Which means the file on that drive is not just supporting evidence, it's the original case." She paused. "It's everything. The foundation. The thing that all the subsequent layers were built to bury." She met Moretti's eyes. "If we present this to the right people, in the right sequence, Reyes can't outrun it. He's been running from this specific document for 7 years. He can't clean what he doesn't have. We need to get it to someone who can use it. Yes, and we need Reyes to not know we have it until it's already in those hands." She looked at the drive. "Which means the next 24 hours are the most dangerous window. He thinks the transfer failed, the error at 97%. He may believe the data is corrupted. And if he believes that, he'll try to recover the physical materials. The boxes, the accordion files." She looked at the bag. "He'll come for those." "Then we let him think he can." She looked at him. "You want to use the physical materials as bait. I want Reyes to come for something I control." His voice was flat and certain and completely without hesitation. "I want him in a location of my choosing, believing he has an advantage, while my people finish the financial work you started. The shell accounts. The funding transfer. You said he has a significant transfer staged. The invasion financing." "Yes. Based on the pattern I documented, there's a transfer window in the next 72 hours. The Allied funds will consolidate before a major operational move. If we can identify the consolidation account before it transfers..." She'd been working this thread in the back of her mind since Oakland, holding it in reserve. "We don't just expose him. We take the operational fund." The car was quiet for a moment. "Redirect it," Moretti said slowly. "Redirect it to Allied accounts you control, before his people can move." She held his gaze. "He loses the financing for the invasion. The Allied bosses who've been backing him discover their committed funds have disappeared. And simultaneously, the documentation my father built, which names Reyes specifically, with full financial chain going back 8 years, lands in front of every relevant authority at once." She paused. "He can't fight on 2 fronts. He can't fight a financial catastrophe and a documentation exposure while simultaneously trying to hold his allied coalition together." Moretti looked at her for a long moment. The flat morning light through the car window was gray and unforgiving, and it showed everything. The cut above his eye with the butterfly closures still in place, the exhaustion in the line of his jaw, the mind behind his eyes moving through her words with the same methodical precision she'd come to recognize as his version of feeling certain. "The transfer window," he said. "You said 72 hours. How narrow is the actual window?" "Once consolidation begins, probably 6 to 8 hours before it settles. After it settles, it becomes significantly harder to redirect without leaving a trail." She paused. "We need to be in the accounts before consolidation starts, which means we need the account number in the next..." She looked at the time. 18 hours. "Can you find it?" "I found 3.6 million in 48 hours with photocopied records," she said. "Give me the full digital access and the transfer pattern data my father built, and yes, I can find it." He made a decision. She could see it happen. The particular quality of his expression when something moved from consideration to resolution, the settling of it. He picked up his phone. "I'm calling the full team in," he said. "Every financial analyst I have. They work under your direction." He held her gaze. "You run the operation." She absorbed this, the weight of it. "You understand I understand you found what 11 experienced people missed." His voice was direct and unornamented. "You run it." She nodded. "One more thing," he said. "Hadley. He's still on the compound, still unsupervised, still believes his contact attempt this morning went undetected." "Did it?" "No." The briefest pause. "But I want him to have one more opportunity to reach Reyes. A specific message. Something that tells Reyes we're coming to him directly. That we've decided to negotiate rather than fight." She understood immediately. "Make him feel safe. Make him think we're weakened enough to come to the table. Give him 24 hours of believing he's winning. And then we take everything he built, everything he funded, everything he planned for 7 years, and we hand him nothing." Moretti's voice did not rise. It never rose. But underneath the control was something absolute and cold and entirely unhurried. The voice of a man who has waited as long as necessary and has arrived at the place where waiting is finished. "He came after my organization. He took one of my men. He killed a man who had a daughter in Sacramento and a grandson who is 4 years old." A pause. "And he spent 8 years making sure Thomas Vale's daughter had nothing." She held his gaze. "He's going to have less than nothing," Moretti said, "when we're done." The secondary location was a property in the inland hills. A working ranch by appearance, a fully equipped operational facility by function. They arrived just past noon. The team Moretti had called was already assembling. 8 people in a room that had been cleared of everything except workstations and the specific quiet intensity of people who understood that the next several hours were determinative. Serafina put the drive on the table, put the accordion files beside it, sat down, opened her notebook. She looked at the room, at these 8 people who were waiting, at the workstations and the screens and the particular opportunity of the moment, at the window beyond which the afternoon was beginning to sharpen toward gold. Her father had gotten this far. He had built the foundation, and it had cost him everything, and he had known the cost before he paid it, and paid it anyway. She picked up her pen. She said, "Here's what we're doing." And she began to talk, and the room leaned in, and outside the window the afternoon light moved across the dry hills in a slow, patient wave, indifferent to what was being built inside, indifferent to the shape of what was about to close around a man who had believed, for 7 years, that the one person who could end him was too small and too broke and too defeated to ever find her way back to what her father left. He had been wrong about that. He was about to find out exactly how wrong, and the finding out was already in motion, and there was nothing left to do now but finish it. The consolidation account appeared at 2:47 in the morning. Serafina had been awake for 21 hours at that point, and the particular quality of her exhaustion had moved past discomfort into something almost clarifying. The way extreme tiredness strips away everything peripheral and leaves only the thing directly in front of you. She was sitting at a workstation in the ranch's operations room with 3 empty coffee cups and her notebook open to a page that was dense with notation. And when the transfer pattern resolved into an account number, she had been chasing through 6 layers of shell documentation for 9 hours. She felt it not as excitement, but as a deep bodily recognition. The way a key feels when it finally finds the right lock. She said, "I have it." The room came alert around her. It was 2:40 in the morning, and there were 5 people still active in the space, and all 5 of them turned with the focused attention of people who had been waiting for exactly this. Moretti was behind her in 4 steps. He looked at the screen. She watched his face from the side. The stillness of it, the complete absence of visible relief, despite the fact that the number on the screen represented the financial engine of an operation that had been trying to destroy him. "Consolidation status," he said. "Shush, initiated 4 hours ago. The transfer window opens in." She checked the pattern, ran the arithmetic she'd memorized. "Approximately 90 minutes. Once it opens, the funds will stage for 6 to 8 hours before settling." She looked at the account number. "We need to be in the routing sequence before the window opens." "Can you do it in 90 minutes? "I can do it in 40 if your people give me what I need." He turned and said 3 words to the man at the adjacent workstation. The man nodded and began typing without further instruction. She worked. She did not think about her father during the 40 minutes it took. She thought about him later, would think about him for a long time. But in those 40 minutes, her mind was entirely occupied by the technical architecture of what she was doing, the specific precision required to insert a redirect into a transfer sequence without triggering the automated fraud detection that Reyes's financial infrastructure certainly had in place. It was the most complex thing she'd ever done with numbers. It required her father's methodology, her own 6 days of accumulated pattern knowledge, and the particular nerve that comes from having nothing left to lose and choosing to act anyway. At 3:29, she leaned back from the workstation. "It's in," she said. Moretti looked at the screen. She watched him read the redirect confirmation. The account number that had been Reyes's operational fund now routed, at the moment of transfer, to a sequence chain that would distribute it across 4 accounts controlled by Moretti's allied operations. Not just secured, distributed. By the time Reyes people noticed the transfer had gone somewhere wrong, the money would be in 4 different institutional locations, each one requiring separate legal process to access, none of them in jurisdictions that would move quickly at Reyes's request. $4.8 million. The war chest that was supposed to finance an organized takeover of the most significant criminal territory on the West Coast. Gone before dawn. "Now we wait," she said. "Now we wait," he confirmed. She pushed her chair back from the workstation and picked up the envelope from beside her notebook. Her father's letter. She'd kept it next to her the entire night, not reading it again, just needing it adjacent. She held it and looked at the ceiling and let herself, for the first time in 9 hours, breathe without a specific purpose. At 4:15, Moretti's phone rang. He stepped away to take it. She watched his back across the room, the set of his shoulders during the call, the single moment where she saw something shift in his posture, a release of tension so minute that she would have missed it 3 weeks ago. She didn't miss it now. He came back. "The documentation package landed," he said. "All 3 distribution points. My attorney, the federal contact, and the journalist who's been building the Reyes story for 2 years. Simultaneously. Simultaneously." He sat down in the chair across from her. He looked tired in a way that was visible for the first time. The exhaustion of someone who had been carrying something very large for a very long time and had just set it down and was now feeling the full weight of having carried it. "It's done," she nodded. "It'll take time to process," he said. "Legal process, journalism process. These things don't resolve overnight." "I know." But he can't contain it. Not 3 simultaneous distributions. Not with the financial collapse happening at the same time. He paused. His allied bosses are going to find out by morning that the transfer they were expecting didn't land. By the time they figure out where it went, they're going to have questions that Reyes can't answer. "And a coalition built on money dissolves when the money disappears," she said. "Yes." She looked at the letter in her hands. "Hadley. My men have him." His voice was even. "He's been in a room since midnight. Man made a 1 contact attempt when he thought he had a window. We let him make it. Reyes got a message that said we were coming to negotiate, which is why Reyes held back tonight. He was waiting for us to come to him from a weakened position." The flatness of Moretti's voice contained a particular quality she'd come to recognize. Not contempt exactly, but the specific register of a man who has been underestimated by someone and has allowed the underestimation to run its course. He'll know by morning that the negotiation was fiction. And Caruso? Found last night. He was at a property 40 miles south waiting. A pause. He won't be waiting any longer. She absorbed this. She didn't ask for details, and he didn't offer them. There was a whole category of this world that she understood in the abstract and chose not to examine in the specific, and that boundary felt, for now, like the right one to maintain. "Danny Rourke," she said. Moretti was quiet for a moment. "He did what you asked. The communication trap worked." Another pause. "He's going to carry what he did for a long time. That's not something I can resolve." "No." She thought about the boy's face in the library, the shaking in his legs. "But he came forward." "He did. That matters." Moretti looked at her. "It matters," he said quietly. "It doesn't undo it." "No, it doesn't undo it." She set the letter on the table between them. "Nothing undoes anything. That's not how any of this works." He looked at the envelope but didn't reach for it. Your father, he said. Yes. I want to tell you something. He looked at the table for a moment, then back at her. I knew Thomas Vale's name before I came to your stepmother's house. The documentation he'd built, fragments of it had circulated in certain circles years ago, before Reyes could fully suppress it. I knew a forensic accountant named Vale had gotten close to Reyes's original infrastructure. I didn't know he had a daughter. He paused. I didn't know about you until I started investigating the debt Miranda was manufacturing. She held his gaze. Why were you investigating Miranda? Because she was connected, through the attorney, to Reyes's network. And I'd been trying to find a lever on Reyes's legal infrastructure for 2 years. He met her eyes steadily. I went to your stepmother's house for a reason that had nothing to do with you, and then I read your file. My file. Employment history, the nursing program, the accounting background, the 6 years of household financial management that were entirely uncompensated and entirely unacknowledged. He paused. And I made a different decision. She was very still. You came for me. I came for a connection to the attorney. I stayed because I read the file of someone who had been systematically reduced for 6 years and had not stopped being exceptional. He held her gaze without flinching. I told myself it was tactical, that your skills were useful. Were you lying to yourself? The pause before his answer was the most honest thing she'd seen from him. Partially, he said. She looked at him for a long moment, at the cut above his eye, still closed, still bruising purple and yellow at the edges, at the exhaustion in his face that he wasn't bothering to conceal at 4 a.m. after everything that had happened, at the man who had walked into a kitchen in a storm and paid $40,000 for a debt that she now needed to understand completely. The debt, she said, Miranda's debt. Was any part of it real? No, he said. She fabricated it entirely. She had legal architecture from the attorney to make it look credible. The documentation was sophisticated. He paused. I knew it was fraudulent when I walked in. You paid $40,000 for a fraudulent debt. Yes. Why didn't you just tell me? Come to me directly. Explain. He looked at her with an action that was as close to dry as she'd seen from him. You were 23 years old, living under a woman who had managed your isolation for 6 years, with no money, no legal standing, and no reason whatsoever to trust a stranger. He paused. If I had come to you directly and said I need your help dismantling the operation that may have killed your father, how many seconds before you called the police? She opened her mouth, closed it. The transaction gave you a reason to come with me that required no trust, he said. You didn't have to trust me, you just had to leave. She sat with this for a while. The operations room was quiet around them, the other people in it maintaining the particular professional discretion of people who understood that some conversations were not theirs to be present in. She thought about the first night, the bedroom with the inside locks, the coffee tray in the morning left without knocking, the library with the books organized by topic, the way he'd told her she wasn't a prisoner without making it sound like a kindness, just a fact. You could have told me at any point in the last 2 weeks, she said. Yes. Why didn't you? He looked at her directly. Because you were doing the work. You were finding things I needed. And every time I considered telling you the full picture, I ran into the same problem. He paused. I didn't want you to feel obligated. I didn't want the decision about staying or leaving to be contaminated by what you owed me or what you thought you owed me. So you waited until it was over. I waited until you had everything you needed to make a free decision. His voice was steady. The $40,000 is gone. The debt is void. You have the documentation from your father. You have enough of the recovered funds to establish yourself independently. You have your name on nothing and nothing on your name. He held her gaze. You can walk out of this facility this morning and never see any of us again. She looked at him. I want you to know that, he said, clearly, without any ambiguity. I understand, she said. Do you? You're telling me I'm free. Yes. And you're doing it at 4 a.m. after we've both been awake for 22 hours, in a ranch facility in the inland hills, before I've slept or eaten anything except coffee. She held his gaze with something that might have been, in another register, almost humor. Excellent timing. Something moved at the corner of his mouth. Not a smile, not quite. but the near relative of one, arriving briefly and departing without commitment. You can make the decision when you've slept. I don't need to sleep to know what I'm deciding, she said. She looked at the letter on the table between them, at her father's handwriting on the envelope, at the object that had been under a metal shelf for 6 years waiting for her. I'm not leaving. He said nothing. He waited. Not because I owe you anything, she said. Not because I don't have anywhere to go. I have somewhere to go now. I have the means to go there, and we both know it. She looked at him steadily. I'm staying because this is the first place in 6 years where what I can do has been worth something, where I've been given a real problem and real resources and trusted to solve it. She paused. I'm staying because my father spent his life on work that mattered, and I spent 6 years in a house where nothing I did was allowed to matter, and I'm done with that. Another pause. And I'm staying because the work isn't finished. He looked at her. Reyes's network is documented but not dismantled, she said. The financial cleanup will take months. There are allied operations that were backing him that still need to be assessed. There are shell structures I identified in the transfer documentation that connect to at least 2 other entities I haven't had time to trace. She held his gaze. There's 6 months of work minimum, maybe more. And after that? After that, we'll see. He nodded, slowly. Once. The nod of a man accepting a thing he was not going to press further. Get some sleep, he said. You too. He stood. At the door of the operations room he paused, back still turned. The 40,000, he said. Yes. I'm going to make sure it comes back to you, out of the recovered funds, with interest, for the 6 years Miranda held you. He didn't turn around. It's not reparation for any of it. It's just math. She looked at his back. My father used to say that money was a record of decisions. He turned halfway, looked at her over his shoulder. The decisions that led to that 40,000 were all Miranda's, she said, and Reyes, and the attorneys. None of them were mine. She met his eyes. Keep the 40,000. Put it toward Sal's daughter in Sacramento. He was still for a moment. Then he nodded, once, and left. She sat alone in the operations room with the hum of the workstations and the first pale suggestion of dawn at the window and her father's letter on the table in front of her. She picked it up. She didn't open it again. She'd read it enough times now that she could recite it. But she held it, feeling the weight of 3 pages and the specific lightness of a thing that had been held too long and could finally be set down at the right moment. Thomas Vale had made a choice. He had known the cost and paid it because the work was worth the cost. That was the whole of the letter, really. Underneath the account numbers and the archive locations and the careful methodical documentation of what he'd found. A man explaining to his daughter that some things were worth the price and trusting her to understand the explanation when she was ready for it. She had been ready for it for a while. She just hadn't had the letter. She set it down. She looked at the window. The dawn was coming in gray and gradual over the hills, the way it always did in this part of the state. Without drama, without apology, just the slow accumulation of light until the darkness was no longer the dominant condition. She thought about Miranda, about the kitchen at 11 at night, and the envelope on the table, and the man who had come to buy her, and the 6 years before that, the long accumulated weight of a life that had been designed to compress her. She thought about it with an evenness that surprised her. Not forgiveness, nothing so clean as that, but a kind of completed understanding. Miranda had been a greedy woman handed legal architecture by a man who worked for a monster, and she had used it the way greedy people used everything, without imagination, without looking at the cost she was imposing, without any awareness that the ledger she was building would eventually come due. The ledger had come due. Serafina had not orchestrated its arrival as revenge. She had followed the numbers because following the numbers was what she did, and the numbers had led where they led. That felt right to her. Her father would have recognized it. He had always said that you didn't expose fraud out of vengeance. You exposed it because the record needed to be accurate. Truth was not a weapon. It was just what was there when you removed everything false. She opened her notebook to a fresh page. The last fresh page, as it happened. The notebook was nearly full. She looked at the blank space and thought about what to write. She wrote her father's name, Thomas Vale, and beneath it, the date he died. And beneath that, without knowing she was going to write it until she did. He was right. It was worth it. Then she closed the notebook. Outside, the dawn had accumulated enough that the hills were visible now, rolling and dry and enormous. The kind of landscape that had existed without any human input for longer than any human structure in view. She looked at it and felt for the first time in what she could not measure, simply present. Not anticipating the next threat, not running the next calculation, not holding herself together for the next thing she needed to get through. Just here. In a room, in a building, in a landscape, at dawn. She allowed herself 10 minutes of it. Then she stood, straightened her jacket, and went to find coffee. The ranch kitchen was at the end of a corridor, and it was Moretti who was there when she arrived, standing at the counter with his back to the door, waiting for the machine to finish, still in the same clothes he'd been wearing since yesterday morning. He hadn't slept. She could see it in the set of his shoulders, the slight heaviness in how he was standing. She sat at the kitchen table without speaking. He poured 2 cups without being asked, and set one in front of her and sat across the table. They drank in silence. The kind of silence that didn't require filling, the particular quiet of 2 people who had been through something together that had no adequate language yet, and had made a mutual unspoken decision to wait for the language to arrive on its own. After a while, she said, "What happens now, practically?" "Reyes will know about the transfer by midday. He'll know about the documentation package by tonight or tomorrow." He wrapped both hands around his cup. "He'll try to run. He has resources outside the organization that aren't touched by what we did, personal accounts, international assets. But running requires a coalition," she said, "and the coalition is going to be asking where the money went." "Yes." He paused. "He'll be contained. Maybe not immediately, maybe not cleanly, but contained." She nodded. She thought about what contained meant in the world she was now formally a part of. Not the world she'd entered by being sold, but the world she'd chosen when she said, "I'm staying." The two were different. The distinction mattered to her, and she suspected it mattered to him, and she thought that they would probably never speak about it directly, but would always understand it. "The attorney," she said, "the one who incorporated the shell for Reyes, the one who processed my father's estate. He's been named in the documentation package." Moretti's voice was measured. "The federal contact will move on him first, before Reyes, because his exposure is cleaner and faster. He's the thread that unravels the legal infrastructure." A pause. "He'll want to cooperate to reduce his exposure. He'll give them Reyes. He'll give them everything." His voice was final in a way that had no heat in it, just certainty. She thought about a man she'd met once, briefly, at 17, in the numb days after her father died. A patient man in a clean office who had guided her through the signing of documents that transferred everything her father had built to a woman who had spent 6 years dismantling it. She thought about how kind he had seemed, how appropriate his condolences had been, how nothing in his face had indicated anything other than ordinary professional sympathy. "People are good at hiding," she said. Not bitterly, just observationally. "Yes," Moretti said, "and some people are good at finding." She looked at him across the table. The morning light was coming through the kitchen window now, actual full morning light, and it was ordinary and specific. It lit the coffee cups and the grain of the table and the bruise above his eye and the new tiredness in both their faces with complete democratic impartiality. "I want a workspace of my own," she said, "a dedicated one, not the library." "Done. And access to the full financial records, all of them, not the subset you've been giving me." He paused briefly. "Not resistance, calculation." "Yes. And if I find something you don't want to see, I'm going to show it to you anyway." "I'd expect nothing else." She nodded, picked up her coffee. "Then we have a lot of work to do." "We do." She drank. He drank. Outside the kitchen window, the morning had established itself completely, all hesitation gone, the hills clear and the sky moving towards something that might, eventually, become blue. She thought about the north corner gap she'd mapped on her second morning at the estate. She thought about the notebook page where she'd written, "He knows," and beneath it, "How much?" She thought about the distance between that woman and this one. The same woman, technically, but different in the specific way that people are different after something real has happened to them. Not transformed, not remade, but settled differently inside themselves, weighted in new places. She was still herself. She had been herself all the way through it. That felt important. She was going to go on being herself, In this place she had chosen with full information and no obligation, and she was going to do the work that her father had started and had trusted her to continue. And it was going to be difficult and sometimes frightening, and occasionally something she didn't have a word for yet. She was not frightened of any of that. She had been frightened of smaller things for too long. She had been frightened of Miranda's moods and Miranda's paperwork and the structural smallness of a life someone else had designed to contain her. She had been frightened by deprivation rather than by anything real. She understood the difference now. She had learned it in 10 days that had contained more reality than the previous 6 years combined. She set down the coffee cup. She looked at Moretti across the table. This man who had made a transaction that was never a transaction, who had told her she was free and meant it, who had asked her to run an operation and stepped back without hedging while she ran it, who had sat in a kitchen at dawn with 2 cups of coffee and given her silence when silence was what she needed and words when they were necessary. She thought about what her father had said in the letter. The last paragraph. The one she'd been carrying all night. I don't know who you'll be when you find this. I only know you'll be more than anyone gave you credit for. You always were. You just needed room. She had room now. She looked at Dante Moretti and he looked back at her, and neither of them said anything, because there was nothing that needed to be said. And they were both the kind of people who understood the difference between silence that was empty and silence that had weight and meaning, and the particular density of everything that had been earned. Outside, somewhere on the drive, a car was pulling in. The day was starting. The work was starting. The long, careful rebuilding of something that had been attacked from within over years. The identification and repair and restructuring of what remained after a long, sustained betrayal was the work of months, not days, and she was already thinking about where to begin. She picked up her notebook, stood, tucked her father's letter inside the front cover, where she would carry it from now on. Not to read, not anymore, but because some things belonged with you, not archived, not put away, but present in the daily weight of what you carried. She'd walked to the door of the kitchen, paused. Moretti. He looked up. Thank you, she said. For the room. She held his gaze. I know what you meant by it. I know you knew what you were doing. A pause. I just wanted you to know. No, I know. He looked at her for a moment. Something in his expression did the thing it occasionally did. The minute softening, the slight lowering of the careful architecture. And then it was gone, and he was himself again, measured and precise and entirely present. Go to work, Serafina, he said. She went. Down the corridor, past the operations room where 2 people were already back at workstations. Through the door that opened onto the morning and the hills and the full, complicated, open reality of a day that had no script and no manager and no debt that someone else had invented to keep her small. She opened her notebook to the last page, the one with her father's name and the date and the 3 words she'd written in the dark before dawn. She turned past it to the inside back cover, the blank hardboard, and she wrote a number at the top. Not a debt, not a balance. An account number. The destination account she'd redirected last night, now safely distributed, now irrevocably beyond Eduardo Reyes' reach. She looked at it. Then she wrote next to it, recovered, redirected, done. She capped the pen. She walked into the morning, and the hills were enormous and indifferent and genuinely beautiful in the way that large old things sometimes were. And the air smelled like dry grass and distance, and somewhere behind her the door closed quietly. And ahead of her the day opened wide and full and entirely, unreservedly hers.